the word belief, its root is love. It's cognate with belieben in German. In Shakespearean English, the word lief meant my dear one, my dear lord, my dear whatever, was one's lief lord, one's lief husband, wife, whatever it was, friend. So it's about, and even the word glauben in German, which is the word for to believe, is related to love, lieben. So initially, belief is not about believing 6 impossible things before breakfast. It's about a disposition of your mind towards the world. And that's why I think it's so important, because we started from attention. And indeed, one of the primal things about all the religious traditions and all the good practices is about paying attention to the world, stilling your own monkey mind, as they call it, your own little chatter about it, and opening yourself to the possibility of learning something and becoming just a little bit wiser. Now, if we don't do that, we're lost.
Need motivation?
Watch a top 10 with Believe Nation.
Hey, it's Evan Carmichael, and I make these videos because you are probably the most ambitious person in your circle, but you know you're capable of more. And you get that push by surrounding yourself with the best. So today, let's learn from one of the best, Iain McGilchrist, and my take on his top 10 rules for success. Enjoy. Rule number 2, have a balance.
The right hemisphere is on the lookout for predators,
right,
whereas the left hemisphere is looking for prey. And this has been confirmed in many species of both.
I'd never heard that second part.
Amphibians and mammals, yes.
So when you're in left hemispheric mode, you're more in predator mode, and when you're in right hemispheric mode, you're more in prey
of course,
mode.
we are not lizards or toads or marmosets or whatever, but in animals, generally speaking, this is the case. Getting and grasping, and after all, our left hemisphere is the one that controls the grasping hand, is left hemisphere, and exploring, which you mentioned, is more right hemisphere. And when a frontal function is deficient, people often go into automatic mode of the hand of that side. And with the left hand, it's usually exploratory motions, meaningless ones, but trying to explore the environment. And with the right hand, it's grasping pointlessly at things. So they, as it were, their automatic thing is with the left hand, the right hemisphere to explore, with the right hand, the left hemisphere to grasp. So when you said exploratory, and you said defensive, and you said also opening up to possibilities, these are all aspects of the way the right hemisphere, I often say the right hemisphere opens up to possibility, whereas the left hemisphere wants to close down to a certainty.
Right.
And you need
That's
both
a chaos
of these.
and order issue.
Chaos and order.
Yeah, exactly.
And I loved in your talk, you talked about a chaos and order, but if I may say so, you seemed, and maybe you'd like to gloss that a little, you seem to suggest that it would be good, we can't get rid of chaos, but you seem to imply that it would be better if we could, whereas my view is that chaos and order are necessary to one another, and there is a proper sort of harmony or balance.
Well,
rule number 3, practice meditation.
Do you practice any form of meditation that's aimed at accessing your right mode of attention? And what do you think about the role of psychedelics in sort of redressing the balance between the hemispheres?
Good questions. Yes, I practice mindfulness meditation. At one point I did practice another form of meditation, but I didn't find it very satisfactory. I find mindfulness very, very satisfactory and very helpful. And indeed, in the current book, I take a section from a book on meditation by a very distinguished Indian guru, probably a world authority on mindfulness. And I just take a couple of paragraphs and point out the 23 things that he says in that quite short space, which refer to hemisphere differences, in each case trying to still whatever it is the left hemisphere is doing and trying to engage whatever it is the right hemisphere is doing. So I haven't the slightest doubt that what mindfulness meditation does is to help us into the right hemisphere. So it is a practical thing that can be done on a daily basis, along with listening to music, reading poetry, engaging in dance, and other and being in nature. I mean, these are all obvious, but they're very, very important. I mean, being in nature is not an optional thing either. It's very new that we don't live surrounded by nature. One of the reasons I actually live where I do is because it's a meditation just to be here. And I feel absolutely deprived and ill when I have to be in a big city.
Rule number 4, understand the soul.
What use is the soul as an idea? And I think I have an answer to that. I think it has a use. And I'm also going to ask, if so, what might the soul be like? And about that, I'm afraid, I am less certain. I expect a lot of us would sympathize with the soldier of Marlborough's before the Battle of Blenheim, who was reportedly heard praying, "O God, if there be a God, save my soul, if I have a soul." Nowadays, it's become a kind of embarrassment to talk about the soul, and yet until now it has been central to most cultures. The word has disappeared, and language is an aspect of reality. If it's true, as Wittgenstein said, that philosophy is a battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by language, making something disappear by language could bewitch us into thinking it didn't exist. Let's think in simple terms. Can this word be substituted? Well, it seems to me to place the person in a widest context, a context outside the confines of immediate time and space, and even to involve an idea of destiny. So, for example, Othello's great lines, "It is the cause, my soul, let me not name it to you chaste stars." It would be difficult to replace that with, it is the cause, my mind, my brain, my emotions. It seems that the concept has a meaning, which we can't exactly say what it is, but it, as I say, sets the human being in a broad context, not the narrow context of where we're encountering the person. And it seems to have this idea of a destiny. And so one gets the idea of Keats's, that the world is a veil of soul-making. What did he mean? He didn't mean that we grow up intellectually. He didn't mean that we got better at being moral citizens. He didn't mean that something happened to our heart exactly. He meant something bigger and deeper. So is our sense of the spiritual something like our moral sense? Well, it certainly has something of that, but it goes beyond it, doesn't it? There's a rather marvelous moment in a play of Iris Murdoch's called Above the Gods. The character says, "In a way, goodness and truth seem to come out of the depths of the soul. And when we really know something, we feel we've always known it. Yet also, it's terribly distant, farther than any star. We're sort of stretched out. It's like beyond the world, not in the clouds or in heaven, but a light that shows the world, this world, as it really is." But they put me in mind, she was a Platonist, of Plato's speaking of philosophy in the 7th letter. He says, "For philosophy doesn't admit of exposition like other branches of knowledge, but after much converse about the matter and a life lived together, suddenly a light, as it were, is kindled in one soul by a flame that leaps to it from another, and thereafter sustains itself." So thinking and moral reasoning are part of it, but what both those passages seem to suggest to me is there is something deeper, more transcendent, over which we have less power. So is it to do with emotion? That's another possible idea, because after all, we say soulful often means with emotion. You could say somebody's unhappy, you could say this is sadness, and in a way that's right, depending on what we mean. The case of depression and so on is not really sadness. Is it perhaps a soul sickness? Psychiatrists, after all, the word means soul doctors, and in German there was the idea that doctors were ministering to die Seele, which is a hard thing to define, but that's the point. We need a word that's hard to define, because if we define it, we'll probably miss the point altogether. Well, let's get a little bit less defined. It could be sort of imagination, something like that. And indeed, again, it often involves imagination, but it surely is other than that and goes beyond it. And there's plenty of imagination which is not in the service of the soul at all.
Also, to make sure you're actually taking action after watching this video, I've designed a special free worksheet just for this video. The worksheet will highlight all of the lessons learned in this video, as well as pull out our 3 favorite learnings and quotes that will inspire you to actually do something. The worksheet will also give you space to write down what your key takeaways are and your specific plan of action to make sure you're getting results. If you want the worksheet designed specifically for this video, absolutely for free, there's a link in the description below. Go click on it and start building the momentum in your life and your business. I'll see you there. Rule number 5, be attentive.
Effectively, people think that they noticed there was a difference between the 2 halves of the brain in the late 19th century. And then this took a step forward in the 1960s and 70s with the first split brain operations in California, in which people's brains were surgically severed in the middle. The connection between the 2 halves of the brain, the corpus callosum, was severed. And so it was possible to interrogate and to investigate one hemisphere at a time. And a number of theories arose out of that. And most of them are now considered wrong. And correctly, they're considered wrong. But the problem that we have 2 rather different hemispheres doesn't go away. Why, if the brain gets its power from making connections, should there be an enormous divide right down the middle of it? And this is not just for humans, this is for all animals that we've studied. They all have an asymmetrical neuronal network with some kind of division between the parts. So I set about investigating that, and it occurred to me that what was the difference was the need to pay attention to the world in 2 different ways at once. And that's a very important point, because how we attend to things changes what we find. Not just whether we're aware of them, but the quality of the awareness changes what it is that we find there. And it also changes us who are doing the finding. So attention is a moral act. It creates or destroys. As you think of a machine, well, what does it do? Well, the left hemisphere does language and reason, and the right hemisphere does pictures and emotion. But this is not right, since all these things are looked after by both hemispheres. But we should have asked a different question. If we'd been thinking in terms of a living being instead of a machine, instead of asking what does it do, as though it's just a functional utility, we'd ask in what manner, how does it do it, and to what sort of end? Because things evolve in living beings in ways that answer to existential needs to be able to carry on being. So, and I think there is an answer to that we do need in order to be able to pay attention to little details of things, which is mainly things that we're going to use, like food, or, if you're a bird picking up a twig to build a nest, or catching your prey. You need a certain kind of attention that doesn't really need to know the whole picture. It just needs to know the little tiny bit in the middle of the picture, which it's very highly focused on. But if it's only paying that kind of attention, it will not survive, because it will become prey to another creature very quickly. So it needs to have a different attention, which is a broad, open attention and a sustained attention.
Rule number 6, explore the anomalies.
For anything to come into existence, there needs to be an element of resistance. And so things are never predicated on one pole of what is always a dipole.
Right.
Everything has that dipole.
Yeah, it's like a
structure.
Prerequisite for being.
It is, and it's imaged in the yin-yang idea. But it seems to me very important, because in our culture we often seem to suppose that certain things are just good and other things are just bad. And it would be good if we could get rid of the bad ones. But actually, by pursuing certain good things that are good within measure too far, they become bad, and so forth.
Right.
But let's go back to your anomaly thing, because Ramachandran calls the right hemisphere the anomaly detector.
Yes.
And so I think that that's a very important point, because there are two ways you can react to an anomaly. One is to, and both have to be explored. One is to try and prove that it's not really an anomaly, and therefore you can carry on with things as normal.
Yes.
And the other is
that's the hopeful. That's what you hope will happen.
That's the typical left hemisphere approach. It doesn't want anything to have to shift.
Yeah.
And quite reasonably, you don't want to be chaotically shifting if you're onto a good thing.
Yeah, it's too stressful.
Exactly.
It takes too much work.
And you might actually be mistaken.
Yes, that too.
In a way, it's perfectly correct to be wary, but it's not correct to be so wary that you blot out anomalies. And there's a lot of evidence, as I'm sure you know, that the left hemisphere simply blots out everything that doesn't fit with its tape. It doesn't see it, actually, at all.
Right.
So there's a hugely important element in the right hemisphere going, hang on, but there may be another way of thinking that will accommodate this better. And actually, good science needs, yes, to be skeptical about anomalies, otherwise there'll be chaos, but it also needs to be able to shift when an anomaly is large enough.
Right.
Or there are quite a lot of them and they don't really fit very well into the scheme.
Exactly.
Rule number 7, embrace suffering.
Like matter, according to Whitehead and Bergson, the soul seems to me to be process, more process than a thing. We come back to the phrase, a veil of soul making. Perhaps not all souls are equal. Perhaps we have to grow our souls. Perhaps souls can be so thwarted that they're almost extinguished. And many people who've talked about the soul have used imagery of fire or water, which are things that are more like energy processes. For example, Eckhart's Funkellein, the little spark, the scintilla animae, the soul spark, which comes from, corresponds to, and reaches out again to the divine. A potentiality, in other words, something in the process of happening, a latent function that needs to be nourished to grow and expand. Nowadays, it's not popular to say that there is a value to suffering, but it is part of the experience of suffering sometimes that it does deepen one's sense of what it means to be alive. A poet that I like very much, Henry Vaughan, well, he had a collection of poems, in fact, called The Silex Scintillans, which means the spark, the sparking flint, the flint from which the spark comes. It comes from the heart and is the spark that is involved in and nourished by suffering. Then I think of that phrase of Wordsworth after his brother was drowned in the Abergavenny, I think it was. A deep distress hath humanized my soul. And thinking of water, one would think of the Tao, the flow of life, which is not far from a kind of world soul, really, and the flow that is in Heraclitus, where everything is flow at the heart.
Rule number 8, don't take things out of context.
The way in which we attend means that we see different things. Not just the breadth or the narrowness of the attention, but the way in which, for what reason we're attending, for example. If we're attending to something because we are fascinated by it, because we're attracted to it, or because we want to eat it, we'll all be rather different. They'll all produce different versions of the world. So these two kinds of attention need to be present at all times and operative, but we don't necessarily privilege the same one in different circumstances. So we may switch from a sort of broad, sustained attention to a narrowly focused attention, or whatever it may be. And these types of attention produce effectively two different qualities of world. And when I say two, I mean they're manifoldly different, but they have many points of difference, in other words. In one, what we see is isolated fragments which are decontextualized, as you say, and quite how important that is something we could come back to. But when you take something out of context, you utterly change its nature, which is why analysis is a very dangerous tool. It can sometimes be useful.
usually for manipulating, but not very good for understanding, because once you've taken things out of their context, they're something else. So you've got a mass of sort of fragments that are distinct, very clear, static, isolated, taken out of context, and dead, effectively. And then the question is, how do we make a living world out of this? How do we get movement? How do we get connection? How do we get flow? How do we get the bigger picture? How do we get a connection with this world from, the idea of us being in here and a world being out there is one that I'm arguing against, actually. But nonetheless, there is an attitude we can adopt in which we're quite alien from something and we see it as just objectively stuck out there. And there's another kind of attention in which we make an important, what I call a betweenness with whatever that is. And out of that, something very rich can come.
Rule number 9, find meaning.
You mentioned that the right hemisphere is involved in understanding and understanding meaning. Okay, what does meaning mean?
Well, yes, a very good question. There are any word you like. The left hemisphere has one idea of it and the right hemisphere a different one. So to the left hemisphere, meaning is something that is, as you might expect, put together from bits. And it could be something we create by, words are tokens, they're put together by systematic syntax, and they turn into a meaning that a computer might be able to find out of a combination of a dictionary and a book of grammar rules. But meaning is not that. When I say that there is meaning in certain experiences, like my wife means everything to me, or this piece of music means so much, or, just being able to walk in wilderness is so important and it brings meaning to things. Now, what I want to stress is that nowadays when people allow that there could be meaning coming from certain experiences, they see that as an invention of ours. So we do this and we think, okay, now we've added some meaning. But that's not the image. That's the left hemisphere image of something that is added to something else mechanically. What I'm saying is we are, in certain experiences, made to be more receptive, more aware of something that is there to be brought into being through the commerce between ourselves, our own consciousness, and whatever it is that we're conscious of. So it's a relational thing. Absolutely, at its core is relation, and at its core is consciousness. So in this way, I found that, you're a physicist, that surprisingly, a lot of physicists have written to me since the Master and His Emissary was published, saying this is very important and interesting from our point of view. And in the book that I've just finished and want to publish in the next few months, called The Matter with Things, I take 3 ways of looking at the world. One is neuroscience, one is philosophy, and the third is physics. And I show that quite coherently, by pursuing each of these paths, we can come to a vision, a Weltanschauung, a picture of the world, which is very, very different from the one that we're taught.
And rule number 10, the last one before some very special bonus clips, is prepare.
What I quite like is the Hasidic idea of soul, in which there are 2 distinct souls. They remind me somewhat of a couple of hemispheres I once described. One is the animal soul, which is all about self-preservation and self-enhancement. And the other is the divine soul, which is driven by the desire to reconnect with its source. And our lives are the story of the interplay of these 2 souls. They're not side by side, by the way, but they're sort of nested, so that the divine soul is inside the animal soul, which is inside the body. The soul is not the same as the body, but it's not opposed to it either. We need to go to people like Goethe and Blake to be able to understand that opposites don't have to eliminate one another. In particular, I like very much Goethe's idea that we find the infinite not by turning our backs on the finite, but through the finite. We find the general not by turning our backs on the particular, but through the particular, and that these are false dichotomies. In fact, in the Hasidic tradition, the nature of Sephirah, which is essentially the created world, is the synthesis of everything and its opposite. For if they didn't possess the power of synthesis, there would be no energy in anything. This is rather like the idea in Heraclitus of harmonia, two poles that are held in tension and out of which the richness of existence occurs. So somehow it's something there that is in the world but not in the world, that is in contact with something other but is also immanent here in the world. And I like that because the idea of creation is to create relationship. And so this otherness needs to be accessible. The divine needs to be both transcendent and immanent at the same time. I come back to that phrase in Iris Murdoch, a light that shows the world, this world, as it really is. The soul is what makes the world authentic. It's what is really in touch with experience. She also says it's terribly distant, farther than any star. We're sort of stretched out. So it has that element of otherness, but it's brought together. And so it's indefinable, but not remote. In Teilhard de Chardin's way of thinking, we might say we are steeped in soul. He has this wonderful expression, by means of all created things without exception, the divine assails us, penetrates us, and molds us. We imagine it as distant and inaccessible, whereas in fact we live steeped in its burning layers. So how do we contact this thing that is other? Well, we need to make an effort. We need to put ourselves in the disposition to understand it. We're not going to understand it at all if we stand there resistant to the idea and waiting for it to sort of turn up as something credible to us. And I'm reminded here of a joke which a Jewish friend told me about a rabbi who's very poor but very spiritual. And his life would be very much more comfortable if he had some money. And he prays to God, please let me win the lottery. And his prayer never seems to be answered. One day he's at prayer, and God says to him, look, Samuel, meet me halfway, buy a ticket. And I sort of feel there's a deep spiritual truth in that we only get there if we are prepared to buy a ticket.
You said either the mind or the brain. It's not correct to think of it as that the brain/mind is grappling with the world, but instead it's bringing the world about. Okay, yes. Now to some, that conflates the objective world with the phenomenological one. So I'm wondering, can you explain what you mean when you say it brings the world about?
Well, I may not be able to explain it very well in language because I think our language is not very well suited to describing reality. It's very well suited to describing everyday things like getting lunch and building a wall. But when it comes to actually understanding what we're dealing with, we don't necessarily have the words for it. And, Bohr himself said there is no way we can talk about physics eventually except in the language of poetry. And he said the same thing is true of philosophy and of the talking about the divine or whatever it is. So, yes, what I've struggled with very much is not collapsing into one or other of two major errors of our age. One is to say, quite simply, it's all made up by us. So it's like we're sitting in a little cinema inside our heads, sitting on a sofa, little homunculus, watching the scene, but we have no contact with the world of anything else out there. And the other is that, just the world is out there, and it's just a matter of going out, measuring it, photographing it, and you've got it. So, in one case, you've got very simplistic materialism, and in the other, you've got very simplistic idealism. And I don't think that either of these positions gets us very far. I think the important thing is to see these bridges, because, as I say, everything is actually connected, and it's through the connection that they come into being. So let me say that again, because it's something that, again, as a physicist, you will understand. You probably know David Mermin, the physicist. He says, relations are prior to relata. Now, I was delighted when I heard that, because I have been working on that basis for most of my adult life. And that sounds nonsense to most people. How can relations exist before there are things that relate? But actually, the things only become what they are in the process of the relationship. Indeed, we only are what we are as human beings in the process of the many relationships we have with other people and with the world at large. And there's an image in the Vedic tradition, which I like very much, of Indra's net. And Indra's net is a cosmic net that covers the whole world. And in it, at every place where the threads cross, there is a little jewel. And in this jewel are reflected all the other jewels and the whole of the net. So it's like a hologram in a way. But what is fabulous about it is that they point out that the threads, the connections, exist before any of the points that make a net. The things that make it a net are the crossings. That's what we see. But they just stand forward after
Interesting.
the relations have done what they are. So I think it's a good image, because I think we tend to focus on certain things that stand forward to us in the world immediately and neglect the background out of which they emerge and from which they're never separate. And this is a very basic neuropsychological distinction between the left and right hemisphere, which you can demonstrate in the lab any day. The left hemisphere sees a single thing of interest that is foregrounded, and it ignores the rest, whereas the right hemisphere sees the whole scene with whatever it is embedded in it.
Because you made it this far in a video, I want to celebrate you. Most people start and don't finish. Most people never actually follow through. Most people say they want something, but they don't ever do the work to actually get it. But you're different. You are special. Believe Nation, you made it here all the way to the end, and I love you. So as a special celebration, if you put a hashtag believe down in the comments below on this video, I will showcase you and celebrate you somewhere on the screen in a future video, because you are awesome. If you want 10 more amazing rules from Dr. Daniel Amen, check out the video right there next to me. I think you'll love it. Continue to believe, and I'll see you there.
When I first scanned myself in 1991, it wasn't good. And just the week before, I'd scanned my 60-year-old mother, and she had a gorgeous brain. And so I